we're gonna work on the facings for our shirt, McCalls 6932. I think this is the hardest part of the shirt, so if you can make it through this, you can do anything. There's a little bit of prep work before we start the big sewing. On your shirt, we've attached the collar, and if we kind of put it on here, this little part, as it goes down this front facing where we have our inner facing, we need to finish it before we can start this part. So you want to finish it. If you have a serger, run it through the serger. If you don't have a serger, I'm going to show you how to finish it. So we're going to start with that. So you will also need your other yoke piece. So get that ready and handy. So let's tilt this down, and I'm going to take you through just finishing that yoke piece. So your pattern doesn't really take this on as a separate instruction. So we're talking about right down this front. If you have a serger, serge it, be done with it. If you don't, just flip that to the wrong side and take your iron and press it over. You don't have to double turn it over, just about 1/4 inch. Turn it over. And you can zigzag that down in place, or you can straight stitch it down. We're gonna press that down. And I'm gonna throw some pins in it so it doesn't move. So do that to both sides of your front. So that's gonna get us started. And I will see you here in a minute. So now I want you to take your yoke, and I'm gonna give it some spray starch because I like spray starch. And what we're gonna do is down here at the bottom, the long edge, I'm going to grab my seam gauge, and I'm gonna press up. I'm gonna measure and press up 5/8 of an inch, which is, you should become really familiar with this. You should recognize that number now. So I'm pressing up 5/8 of an inch. 5/8 of an inch is our seam allowance. In general home sewing, 5/8 of an inch has always been your sewing seam allowance. So I'm going along, pressing that up at 5/8 of an inch, and going along. I'm gonna finish this off. Kind of skipping ahead here. Measure it out. With that spray starch kind of makes it just sticky enough to stay, and so it will stick in place while I do this. That's why I like it so much. So I have it just, I want it to be exact because it needs to match up my other piece that I'm gonna sew it to. Okay, so, and I am done. So now I'm gonna take my scissors and I'm gonna trim off just a little bit. So by a little bit, I mean I'm gonna trim off 1/4 inch. So it's gonna finish 3/8 of an inch. I'm eyeballing it, and I'm just gonna trim it down a smidge. Because when I sew this to my other piece and it matches up to the other yoke piece, I don't want those seam allowances to be the same length because it gets too bulky. I want them to be what's called graded. seam allowances, so they're all different heights. Now I need my finished shirt. Well, it's not finished, but my almost finished shirt. And this is where it's going to get tricky. So this next part is pretty tricky. So we're going to take our yoke, and with right sides together, so we pressed up the bottom, and we're going to lay, we have our shirt laid so that the collar is facing up, and we have, so you want to have it down on your table so that these your interfaced front facings are facing up, and just place your yoke kind of, for right now, just kind of hold it here. So you're going to take that front facing and you're going to match it to the yoke so that it forms the neckline. So this neckline is going to be like a continuous circle almost. So place the front facing that neck edge even with the yoke, and then this other neck, this other front facing even with the other yoke shoulder edge. Hopefully this will become clear in a minute. I'm gonna hold this up. So do you see how this becomes a, so here's your collar. Here's your yoke. And see how we're just gonna sew right here. So the yoke continues here. Here's your, that's your notch. And here's that front where we interfaced. And it continues. So we're just gonna sew here. And then on this other side, we're gonna sew the other side of the yoke on this side. And we're gonna sew it at 5/8. Always sew at 5/8 unless I tell you not to. So I'm gonna sew that and then I'll be right back. So I just sewed that yoke to those front facings, and so I'm gonna take out those pins. And I'm gonna press those seam allowances towards the yoke. So I'm gonna turn this around. And I'm gonna press, and I'm gonna continue that seam allowance down that yoke. You can't see it. So I'm gonna continue it down 5/8. And that seam allowance is pressed towards the yoke. And this, on this side, that seam allowance presses over. And this seam allowance presses towards the yoke. And now what I'm gonna do is gonna hold up that neck where that collar is. And it's gonna get closed up. So if you see that I can fold it where that interfacing kind of meets, and you're gonna match that notch. I'll pin. I'm gonna pin. And I'm gonna, that shoulder seam matches. I'm gonna match up that shoulder seam right there. You see how that shoulder seam matches? I'm gonna pin right there. make sure everything's smoothed out. I'm going to come over here, I'm going to match this notch. I'm going to match up this shoulder seam. And I'm going to match, where I folded it over is where that interfacing ends. It's going to end up being the front of your shirt. That fold line ends up being the very front of your shirt. And then I'm just going to pin along this curve. This is where your collar is. We sewed where your collar went. It's just the back curve. Your collar seam fits in there. So your yoke sandwiches your collar. And I am almost done pinning, and we're gonna sew 5/8 of an inch. It's a curve. You see that? So we're gonna sew this curve, and it goes from the front of your shirt to the back of your shirt, and you don't want any puckers. It's easy to get a pucker, so you want to check that when you're done sewing. If you get a pucker, you're going to unpick it and sew that little piece again. So let me turn it around to show you the other side. Here's what the other side looks like. This is what you're going to sew, 5/8 of an inch. Okay. This part is step 20, if you're following along. Okay, so I sewed that neck, that curve, that whole back curve. So I'm going to remove all those pins. If you checked it and you don't have any puckers, you can come in with your scissors, and what you want to do is take your scissors, and you're going to want to just clip into that curve, and that releases the pressure, so that it will lay nice and smooth. So I'm just going to clip that in like that. Nice, nice, nice. Okay, we're doing okay now. That was the hardest part. So now we're going to flip it to the right side. We're going to flip it, and we're going to press it, so it should look pretty much like a shirt. You might feel a nice sense of satisfaction. So you should have something that looks like a collar and a yoke. And so you're going to press it, and make sure it's nice and smoothed out. Pressing makes a big difference in making something look like something you'd want to wear. And then we have a little bit of hand stitching to do. A little bit of hand stitching. So on the inside, you still need to do a little bit of pressing. Where the yoke seam line here, this long edge should meet up with your other long edge of your yoke. And so you're going to pin that in place. And that, for right now, you're going to slip stitch that by hand. So pin that. That should match. then here at the shoulders, where we press that little bit over, I'm gonna wait. I need one more pin here. We're gonna, that should match that other shoulder seam, and that's gonna get slip stitched. Slip stitched. We did that in class. Those are those invisible stitches that you do. So pin to the shoulder seam, pin along the yoke. So pin, 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 and then slip stitch. And we are done with that. That is your hard little bit. If you have any puckers, before you slip stitch, fix your puckers because you won't be able to get back in there. Okay? Great. See ya.